Welcome everyone to our Ocean Memory seminar. Today's seminar is Memory and Saturated Oceans. And I'll just read the first paragraph of the email because I think it actually expresses it so well. Memory is often thought of as a form of writing, inscription, or marking. But what happens to the material imagination of memory when dealing with water or the ocean? Does the concept of, quote, saturation, meaning thoroughly soaked, do something different to the ways we approach the study of memory by offering a less terrestrial metaphor? This set of talks by Melody Ju and Stefan Helmerich explores how we might think about saturation, drawing on their contributions to the collection Saturation and Elemental Politics from Duke University Press in September of 2021, edited by Melody Ju and Rafika Ruiz. And I'm Kathy Foley-Meyer. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. And Rebecca Retstein is going to introduce today's speakers, and then they're each going to give a presentation, and then we'll do our question period afterwards.
Yeah, it's great to be here with all of you, and we're so happy to have Stefan and Melody with us. I just wanted to say that when we were floating this idea of having the two of them speak together, I was just thinking about, the synergy that they both seem to have together. And I didn't even realize that they were both contributing to this publication that's coming out in September called An Elemental Politics. So it was definitely meant to be to have them speak together. And I just wanted to say that Melody, I had the pleasure of meeting Melody at the very first Ocean Memory workshop in Friday Harbor in 2017. And Stefan was brought into the fold at the Cognition and Genomics workshop and has really become, I feel like, an essential contributor to this group. So it's just really great to have both of you here. And I will just read their short abbreviated bios. They have a lot more accolades other than this, but Stefan Helmerich is professor of anthropology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is author of Alien Ocean, Anthropological Voyages in Microbial Seas from 2009, and Sounding the Limits of Life, Essays in the Anthropology of Biology and Beyond from 2016. His essays have appeared in Critical Inquiry, Representations, American Anthropologist, The Wire, Cabinet, and Public Culture. Melody Ju is Associate Professor of English at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She is the author of Wild Blue Media, Thinking Through Seawater, Duke University Press 2020, and co-editor with Rafika Ruiz of Saturation, Duke Press 2021. Her essays have appeared in journals including Gray Room, Configurations, Media and Environment, Women's Studies Quarterly, and Resilience. And with that, I guess, do you guys want to take it away?
Sure. So I think the plan is for me to give a very quick sort of 2-3 minute introduction to the book collection in which both of our talks appear, and then I'll turn it over to Stefan for the first talk. So let me go ahead and share screen. I just have 2 images to share here. This is so you can look at the cover. So Saturation started as an idea for a conference on environmental media studies, but my co-collaborator, Rafika Ruiz, we agreed that environmental media was too general a topic at this point because there'd been so many events organized around it. So we were thinking, what's more specific than that? So after some brainstorming, we thought about saturation as a topic because of the many ways people talk about saturation. So even though we're borrowing from a kind of chemistry understanding of the term, you can also think about cognitive saturation, saturated markets, or say Zoom saturation when you're just feeling overwhelmed by how much time we spent on this app, or things. So there's been a tendency to think of, so we're thinking about the richness of saturation and wondering where people would take it. We also thought it was a useful term just because it got around one of the tendencies we've seen in the humanities to organize different kinds of research around particular objects or particular substances. So for example, I might trace the way water functions in Latinx literature, or what if we think of salt as a medium? These are ways of identifying a substance ahead of time. And we thought that one thing saturation could do was to pose a different, almost more sciencey question, which is what saturates what in a given situation without knowing or naming what those things are in advance. So you kind of start with a situation and then examine the material, substances or elements that might be in that situation, but also different cultural connections and things that go beyond that. So the book has 4 different sections. There's water, thresholds, phase change, and the precipitate. Phase change in particular came out of an excellent quote by my colleague, Janet Walker, who observed that if for the ethnographer Mary Douglas, dirt is matter out of place, then perhaps climate change is matter out of phase. And we really like that term, or that sort of figuration. And so phase change sort of comes from that, and also works really well with my colleague who is thinking about desalination as a process. So what Stefan and I have to present today are each of our respective chapters from this book. You'll notice that Stefan's is first, so we're going to start with him. And I just wanted to offer a few questions about memory to frame why we picked this collection, in addition to the fact that it's coming out in September. So one is that if memory is thought of as a form of writing or encoding, these follow different kinds of metaphors that imagine paper or instruments that mark or cut in some way. So what happens to the material imagination of memory when you move to a kind of liquid medium? And so the questions we also bring to this are, what if we think of saturation as offering other approaches to memory? And this is part of the hunch that we might not only study memory in the ocean, but imagine how oceanic context have something to offer to the study of memory itself. Okay, so I'll stop there and turn it over to Stefan.
Okay. Well, thank you, Melody, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate in the book, which has been a real pleasure. And thank you, Rebecca and Kathy, for the invitation and the kind introductions. All right, so this is adapted from that, from the essay that I wrote for the book. On a color-coded map offered in 2013 by the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO, the organization predicted dangerously low aragonite saturations in many areas of the ocean adjacent to where coral today lives. Undersaturations that the commission represented in lava red, carrot orange, and yellow. By the year 2100, according to the commission, ocean acidification consequent upon global warming may be accompanied by shifts in the saturation of ocean aragonite, a mineral that coral and shellfish rely upon to build their carbonate skeletons. For people with normative color vision, tutored in Western histories of color symbolism, what may be unsurprising is the association of the color red with the alarming, the dangerous, and the extreme. For people conversant with the technicalities of color theory, what may also be striking is the saturated quality of all of the colors in this image. If color saturation is, let's see, the degree of intensity of a color, the saturation of all of the colors in this image is high, intense. This may be no surprise, since this image employs what the computer scientist Kenneth Moreland describes as, quote, the most common color map, a mapping of numerical values to color used in scientific visualization, namely the rainbow color map, which cycles through all of the most saturated colors, unquote. The makers of this world map have calibrated their aragonite saturation data values so that beautiful blues correlate with healthy areas and bold and rusty reds with regions in trouble. Red, according to the key, means corrosive. Aligning the values of the rainbow map with eco-iconography about ocean vitality, and even with touristic associations of tropical seas with luscious light blues. The result is, as Roland Barthes famously put it in an analysis of images, that, quote, the viewer of the image receives at one and the same time the perceptual message and the cultural message, unquote. And here, a scientific one too. It is as though seawater has been abstracted in such a way as to imply that its liquidity can support a durable, quasi-empirical kind of indexical writing. The cultural resonance of the chemical circumstance of saturation with a visual representational scheme that makes use of highly saturated colors is indebted here to a category crossing pun on the word saturation. And that pun, which is the use of a word in such a way as to suggest two or more meanings or different associations, is of course not my doing. It's not my fault that there's a pun here. Since saturation, according to the OED, is also the condition of being thoroughly soaked. Can you still see that? The condition of being thoroughly soaked, or more archaically, the complete satisfaction of appetite, which has analogical precedents and extensions to chemistry, the action of charging or the state of being charged up to the limit of capacity, to physics, the condition of holding as much suspended matter or of being as highly charged with electricity, heat, etc. as possible, to magnetism, the condition of being strongly magnetized as possible. Shout out to Max for the mention of magnetism earlier today. To the curious conjuncture of hematology and deep water diving, the retention by the blood of the greatest amount of inert gas possible under a given pressure, and chromatics, the degree of intensity of a color, relative freedom from admixture by white, and more. So saturated colors are a persistent feature of contemporary scientific maps. And here's one of temperature. Because of the wide popularity of the rainbow color map, which maps, again, scalar or numerical values like temperature or saturation through the spectrum of colors in a rainbow. Maps of rising sea surface temperatures very often move toward red as a representation of rising heat and implicitly danger. The color red in such representations relays symbolic heat, inviting an ocular participation of fevered pop scientific vision. Such symbolic heat can guide or detour interpretation in predictable as well as unpredictable ways. If, as Barth wrote in Rhetoric of the Image, symbolic meanings can, quote, remote control the viewer toward a meaning chosen in advance, unquote, so too can they swerve the reader off in other directions. Symbolic heat might be imagined as a genre of what Nicole Starosielski, following Marshall McLuhan, has called media heat, referring at once to various media's associations with one, the cool or the hot, where photography freezes like ice and cinema flickers like fire, 2, degrees of communicative conductivity, or 3, the ecological footprint of media's associated network technologies. Sometimes in ocean maps, the saturation of colors, or to be exact, the symbolic heat of red, takes on a rhetorical life of its own, at times tethered and at times not at all to an invocation of physical saturation. So take as one peculiar case in which a representation became so affectively striking that it invited misinterpretation, a map offered by the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration in the aftermath of the March 11, 2011 Tohoku tsunami. This high contrast, almost psychedelic chart of the Pacific Ocean, a mapping that was an output of a forecast model fit to the records of the actual event, was streaked by bright red tracks snaking their way away from the coast of Honshu, where the quake had its epicenter. And note that this is not a false color image in which wavelengths are shifted up or down, but it is rather a graph in which numerical values are mapped in an arbitrary but conventional way to a spectrum of color. The rainbow color mapped image and graph of wave heights was still was soon erroneously taken up by people worried about radiation leaking from the Fukushima nuclear plant into the Pacific Ocean. So the cover for a Ventura County newspaper, emblazoned with the phrase "a radioactive nightmare," reproduced the image to represent not wave amplitudes, which is what it represented, but radiation streaming toward California. CNN announced that the water used to cool the Fukushima plant was, quote, saturated with contaminated water that was leaking into the ocean, unquote. So that language of saturation saturated a lot of the descriptions in different registers. Even more sober maps of ocean color created by, oh yes, I put this in here because there is this kind of optical unconscious kind of echo of earlier, this is a World War II representation of the tentacular power of Japan, about which Dutch colonial officials were worried with respect to Indonesia. Back to NOAA. So even the more sober maps of ocean color created by NOAA's Ocean Color Science Team, which are dedicated to processing satellite imagery of Earth's ocean and presenting the color of the ocean during the day, it must be noted, doesn't always hew to a realist accounting of the color of seawater, since the team can also overlay such imagery with rainbow color mapped data in ways that partially evoke or draw upon realist colorology, even as they also edge into the territory of the iconic and the hallucinatory, as with here, water that's colored in neon green and blue, which is meant to represent chlorophyll concentration. So it's relaying a kind of symbolic coolness. So you have these different kinds of image semiotics going on at the same time, right? The kind of realist photographic one, but then also this one that is kind of a graph. And there's a lot more I can say and have said about saturated colored maps of the ocean, but I want to leap over from the symbolism of red and blue and make note of another color circulating in recent ocean-themed art, and that is the color purple. But before I do that, let me do a detour into thinking about the color of the ocean surface. So the color of the sea in the representations I've shown have been about the skin of the sea. The trans-ocean theorist Ava Hayward, who is collaborating with a photographer named Adela Licona, she and I have been recently collaborating on a piece exploring how and whether the skin of the sea has been racialized. And we draw on the work of Anne Cheng, who argues in her book Second Skin, her analysis of the making of the modern surface in coordination with the making of skin as a racialized surface, that skin has come to be employed as a disclosure of essence, that skin has come to be taken to be a disclosure of hidden truths. So racism in this regime relies on the presumption of seeing race as color as a pointer to depth, to deep meaning, what Frantz Fanon once called an epidermal racial schema, the skinification of raciality. So think of the saturated and, I would argue, racialized surfaces of the oceanic oeuvre of filmmaker James Cameron in, say, Titanic and Avatar. So consider the bright white of the Titanic, rhyming with the beleaguered whiteness of the passengers escaping its sinking, facing the dangerous, luminous black of the sea, and recall that the Titanic was part of the White Star Line, the afterimage inspiration for Marcus Garvey's Black Star Line. Or consider how Cameron's blue alien people in his movie Avatar invoke the semiotics of epidermalized race while refusing the explicit specificities of actual colorist racism, which are never about the color blue. With the alien skin, a wrap of blue surfaces that makes them into walking oceans whose sublime glow wants to exist outside the coloring book of history. Okay, so from blue to purple, my inspiration for making this leap is artist Sonder Perry's 2018 piece called Typhoon Coming On, in which we see a full wall video screen showing digitally animated close-ups of the water in the famous J.M.W. Turner painting from 1840, Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and Dying, Typhoon Coming On, which is a representation of a 1781 event in which a Liverpool slave ship, the Zong, threw overboard, that is, murdered, 142 captives to recalibrate its ballast and also claim insurance money. One component of Perry's Typhoon Coming On is a 3-screen experience in which zooming in on Turner's waves glitches and turns purple. Perry's selection of purple as the ocean color offers museum copy corresponds to the color warning used in software indicating an error with the software, unquote. So we're still in the realm of the digital, but we're getting past digital saturation here, or rather beneath the materiality of digital saturation in representations of the sea. Or consider British Ghanaian artist Jana Comfra, who has lately composed a 6-channel video installation on climate change called Purple, which catalog copy argues works as, quote, a hybrid hue that combines the coldness of blue and the warmth of red, but that is also meant as a reference to Tyrian purple, an expensive pigment which was initially created from a rare type of gastropod and became a symbol of might for Roman and Byzantine emperors, unquote, and works as, quote, a reminder of an early example of humankind's exploitation of nature, not for survival, but as a means of acquiring wealth and demonstrating power, unquote. So purple activates a different color symbolism, a weird non-naturalistic association, a mixture of nature and culture. And finally, think of the Syrian filmmaker Amel Alzakut and her collaborator Khaled Abdul Wahed, who in their 2020 movie Purple Sea used footage captured from a camera that Alzakut had strapped to her wrist when the smuggler's boat she had joined to travel to Europe capsized off the coast of Greece, leaving Alzakut in the water for 5 hours, during which time, before her rescue, 42 of the 316 passengers from her boat perished. Recalling the nightmare in the second person, she recalls, quote, "You lie on your back in the water, under the surface. The sea is purple. You can see the sunlight, how brightly it shines into the water. You feel the purple water encircling your body," unquote. So purple is a pointer to the uncanny. Think back now to the image with which I opened this talk of aragonite saturation, a symbolic analysis that would account for color theoretic confusion about saturation, affects about healthy seas, and more might be a good way to explicate the intermingled encounter of a representation of acidified water with viewers keyed to tune into the symbolic heat of color. Of course, viewers may take the wrong message from this image's intermingling of red and low chemical saturation. So it's perhaps no surprise then that another version of this kind of visualization of aragonite saturation exists, in which things are flipped the other way, in which the rainbow color map is coded to offer high saturation areas as red instead of low. So if ocean acidification is global warming's twin, one could argue for either aligned, like a conjoined twin, or inverted, like an evil twin, color for either of these two images I've presented, though we also don't really get away from the problems that the rainbow color map presents by just flipping associations. And here's the kind of color theoretic accounting of the confusion that the color map can represent. You know, that saturation and luminosity don't track one another. So if a color saturation map is turned into black and white, a lot of information gets lost. So even the kind of most mechanically objective attempt to kind of map one thing to another runs into trouble. Now note also that there is no purple on the rainbow color map, the color that I just pointed to as a representation of trauma that is difficult to represent. Purple, according to color theorists, is in fact not, like its hued relation that you might think of, violet. It is not a color on the visible spectrum. It is not a color in the rainbow. Electromagnetically speaking, there is no such thing as a frequency of purple light. There is only the mix in the perception of color-sighted people of the red and the blue together. It is the color purple is in experience. It's in apprehension. It's not in the spectrum. So perhaps it saturates experience through what the artist Prince once called purple rain. Precipitation that he said, quote, pertains to the end of the world, unquote. Purple rains into the saturated sea, turning it into a species of what Melody Jew calls the Anthropocene's negative media, a proposition about what may and may not be possible to remember about the ocean. Thank you.
Wow, thanks, Stefan. It's always exciting to see what extra you add into the talk, and I think the purple connections are so interesting to think with. Okay, so I'll go ahead and go back to sharing my screen here. I also realized I completely forgot my manners and just wanted to thank Rebecca and the other organizers from Ocean Memory for the opportunity to speak with Stefan today, and including all the behind the scenes work that you've been doing to keep this a really vibrant and ongoing conversation with so many people from many fields. Okay, so what I'm talking about today has to do with a seaweed archive that a student tipped me off about at UC Santa Barbara at the Cheadle Center for Biodiversity and Ecological Restoration. And so when I learned about this, I thought, oh, we have one of the larger archives of Southern California seaweeds. I have to go check this out. And so that's what this talk comes from. Okay. While exploring the algal herbarium at UC Santa Barbara a few years ago, I came across a folder containing an elegant sample of Macrocystis pyrifera, or giant kelp, collected from Imperial Beach, California in 1964. The specimen spirals up the large sheaf of paper, positioning you to look at it as if you were a diver floating above. Exhibiting a range of pigment intensity, the kelp blades appear like watercolors, fading from marigold to chocolate. As I carefully turned each page, making sure that the specimens didn't fall off the herbarium paper, I wondered, what is the nature of kelp as media in the archive, the ocean, and in relation to photography? What do processes of saturation with seawater, light, and other elements have to do with these archives of what one might call recorded memory? Finally, can seaweeds teach us something about the materiality of memory connected not only to inscription, but also to saturation? So seaweed is an umbrella category for several forms of marine macroalgae, which many people on this talk will know well, but I'll repeat just to synchronize us. The reds and greens are more closely related to plants, whereas the brown kelps are more closely related to diatoms. The CBER, which is again the acronym for the herbarium, CBER not only features a diversity of specimens, about 8,000 total, but also a range of materialities involved in the production and preservation of seaweeds and kelp as storage media. When I visited, I was struck by the fact that the herbarium, comprised of a series of tall metal cabinets containing these stacks of manila folders, happened to be directly across the hallway from a library with a series of books and bookshelves about algae and marine plants. So you could say that spatially, the kelp cabinets and the library were mirror images of each other across the hallway, each containing different kinds of archival media. Yet from another point of view, one could say that seaweeds seem to exist in the ontological gap between writing and paper itself. CBER samples of red seaweed depicted here in this particular species was recently named Pyropia instead of Porphyra. It reminded me of a new form of paper of a kind. You could see that how the edges sort of thin out and blend into the sheaf of paper. And on the right, another sample looks almost plasticky, kind of translucent and glossy red. On the other hand, as the subject of poetry, seaweeds are sometimes figured as a kind of oceanic writing or a cursive written on the beach. Take, for example, the following lines from Derek Walcott's poem, The Bounty. where he writes, quote, "A universal meter piles up these signatures like inscriptions of seaweed that dry in the pungent sun, lines ruled by meter and laurel, or spray swiftly garlanding the forehead of an outcrop." In Walcott's metaphor, the kelp would be the writing and the beach a kind of paper page garlanded by spray. And I should also mention that Walcott's famous for writing another poem called The Sea is History, which is another interesting one to think with in terms of memory. So the longer I explored the collection, the more I came to understand that books and dried seaweeds have a very different relationship to saturation. So they're not twins, they're actually a bit different. In library books, water was only used in the making of paper and the printing of ink. In the seaweed collections, by contrast, we see them as a kind of working collection. So occasionally scientists will come in and cut off a small piece of the kelp, soak it in water, and then count the number of cells of thickness in that blade in order to learn something about its morphology. And then when they're done, they can simply re-dry the kelp and then put it back in the same manila folder where the rest of it is kept. So the nature of seaweed samples as archival media has everything to do with their potential to become saturated with water, regaining their original form in nature. Water activates the archive of kelp, which otherwise lies dormant in its desiccated state. And this is not something you can do with the flower pressings. And so this is really a unique property of this other botanical medium, the seaweeds. Okay, so part of the importance of being able to study seaweeds in their resaturated form is that it enables phycologists to ask questions about the relation between morphology and environment. These differences, highlighted when wet, are shaped by the specificity of the kelp's immediate environment. So a lot of the examples I took a look at were of macrocystis from around different places from around the world. And the fun thing to look at was that they didn't all look the same. So an example in South Africa might look really different than a sample in Santa Barbara. But then even within Southern California, you might have slightly different shapes that the seaweed grew into, depending on factors like access to sunlight, depth where the specimen grew, whether there was wave action where it grew, or calm waters, and other types of factors. And so, in other words, members of the same species will grow into slightly different forms depending on the particularities of their microenvironments. From this perspective, one could say that each of the dried seaweeds are snapshots of the gene expression of a particular specimen in the ocean. But the seaweeds also have a history with a different kind of snapshot, which is cyanotype photography. This is something I can say a little bit more about if anyone's interested, but there's some fascinating connections between seaweeds and photography. So in one example, daguerreotypes used iodine vapors that were derived from seaweed in order to make photosensitive plates. So it exists there. There's also, I've been hearing from some artist friends in London that there have been a number of developer workshops for film photography that use seaweed and vitamin C, as well as a few other substances. So there's a way in which seaweeds aren't only the subject of photography, but also contribute the physical materials that go into making photo prints. And I think that that's kind of fun. Okay, but for here, seaweeds have also played an important role in the feminist history of photography as the first subject of a book of cyanotypes, leaving their white shadow on light-sensitive paper. And actually strikes me, I think there's something to talk about with Stefan here too as well, about purple versus blue, but then also the whiteness of the shadow of the seaweeds left on the paper. Cyanotype photography was invented by John Herschel in 1842, but was used by Anna Atkins when she was a young woman in the world's first book of privately published photographic prints called British Algae Cyanotype Impressions, and this was in 1843. So here, botany and phycology, so the studies of terrestrial and marine plants, were some of the few subjects that were considered appropriate for women in the 19th century, in 19th century Britain to study. Cyanotypes were uniquely democratic in that all you needed was the paper, you didn't need an expensive camera. And you could also self-publish fairly easily just by making repeated prints. It is for this reason that cyanotypes were retained in architecture as a convenient way of duplicating designs, giving their name to the word blueprint. This process of making a cyanotype involves washing a thick sheet of paper with a solution of two chemicals, ferric ammonium citrate, and potassium ferrocyanide. Once the paper is evenly saturated with these liquid solutions and dried in a dark room, I've stained a lot of material in my bathroom before from trying this out, it is ready for use as a photosensitive surface. The photographer places objects directly on paper, exposes them to sunlight for a few minutes, and then develops the images by placing the paper in fresh water in order to stop the development process and fix the shadow of the objects. When I have attempted this in Southern California, I feel that I am also getting tan at the same time I'm waiting for the print to develop, in part because the sun is really strong here. And so I think there's also something to say or to think through about cyanotypes and skin exposure. And the situation would have been very different for Atkins as she was making these in Britain, which has a lot gentler gentler sun. So this process recalls photographer Jeff Wall's provocative essay, Photography and Liquid Intelligence, in which he described water as photography's forgotten techne or technology, or the way that water as a technology has long had a role in processes of washing, bleaching, dissolving, and dyeing fabrics. The precondition for saturating paper with photosensitive chemicals enables the sun's own writing to substitute for hand-drawn illustrations. So for example, cyanotypes are really useful if you don't want to hand draw all the small filaments that are coming out of the seaweed, like the image on the right here. Atkins' preface to British Algae itself was writing that was not written on paper, but writing that was made into a cyanotype itself. 3 paragraphs were written on a transparent medium, probably glass, and then photographed through the paper and exposed to sun. Even the title of British Algae itself appears in a similar way, except that here you can see it appears to be a kind of hand-designed font augmented by small, minute strands of seaweed. As Larry Schaff notes, quote, "The letters appear to have been formed by delicate strands of seaweed, while actual specimens could have served for this. Perhaps she applied her skills as draftsman to the task." So here's an interesting case where I think, earlier I mentioned the connection between seaweed and paper, but also seaweed and writing. And here we have kind of a merger of the two. The seaweed seems to be absorbed or fade into the paper at the same time that it also participates in the graphic inscription of writing on this page. Additionally, Atkins' handwritten cursive labels under each seaweed specimen are curved in a style that evokes algal forms. Because these labels inhabit, quote, "the same ocean-evoking space of the cyanotype page," Carol Armstrong proposes that writing and the photographic specimen are of the same order of the trace. Now, Atkins cyanotypes not only demonstrate a strong ontological affinity between seaweeds and writing, but also with seaweeds and photo paper. So one of the other arguments I make at length in the piece is to compare how each of these pages of photosensitive paper is similar to the seaweeds themselves, in part because the seaweeds photosynthesize, so you could say they're sensitive to light, but same with the page. And this connection between either plants or, in this case, algae and photomedia has a long history. And Despard and Gallagher, who are 2 theorists, have called this a kind of photomedia. So they define photomedia as the, quote, "strategic abstraction that enables us to identify visual relations in which plants and cameras, or in here, in this case, photopaper, are both implicated." So this is an interesting analogy, I think, between a kind of natural media and also a kind of anthropogenic media. So a photosensitive surface that humans create. And also, while I'm thinking of it, I should mention that the Tyrian purple Stefan was talking about, I learned from Josie Iselin that that was also a photosensitive pigment. So even though it wasn't used this way in clothing, theoretically, you could have made cyanotypes using that snail product. Which is actually, maybe that's the connection between our, sort of 2 talks here is the snail goo. So going further, photography theory has also drawn other analogies between plant leaves and photosensitive paper, going all the way back to Aristotle. So he once observed the, quote, "light filtering through leaves to form the half eclipsed sun on the ground." So instead of looking up at the eclipse and getting burned, he looked at the way that the eclipse was actually being was able to be seen on the ground through the shadows of tree leaves. Or we could look to Roland Barthes and his quote about the life cycle of plants and film photography. So he writes, quote, "Like a living organism, photographic paper is born of grains of silver which germinate, bloom for a moment, and then grow old. Attacked by light, by humidity, it grows pale, it is exhausted, and disappears." So there's a kind of connection between the ephemerality of botanical media like plant leaves and also the way that Barthes thinks about photo paper itself here. So for me, part of the pleasure in gazing at Atkins cyanotypes has to do with the visual match between the blueness of the paper and the aquatic subject of the seaweeds. After all, cyanotypes themselves look wet. In her introduction to Ocean Flowers, Catherine de Zager writes that Atkins cyanotypes retain traces, quote, "as though the slithery underwater plants were absorbed by paper," a phrasing that suggests a process of paper being saturated by a shadow rather than written or inscribed by it. In addition to evoking ocean water, cyanotypes also need fresh water for their maintenance. So if your cyanotype ever fades, you can just resubmerge it to bring the blue back to a stronger, stronger hue. So the pressed specimens of the algal herbarium at Sieber and Anna Atkins cyanotypes are media forms that suggest a more environmentally distributed sense of photography. So this is a photography or practice that doesn't just happen in the camera, but instead depends on multiple elements of the environment. So here we might consider the way that the world is both the camera apparatus that develops the organism and also the darkroom responsible for developing the paper. So I'd like to conclude with a few thoughts on how this all might relate to memory. I've spent some time discussing how seaweeds are an interesting archival medium that can rehydrate, but also how they're connected to cyanotype photography. This is about expanding definitions of media made by humans to elements of the natural environment, something I'm also in conversation with John Darren Peters about, but also blurring the lines between the two. So I want to offer a few ways of how thinking with water and saturation might have implications for how we think about recorded memory or archival memory. And I should mention for context here that when I taught an ocean memory seminar with Alison Santoro 2 years ago, we came up with a couple different types of memory to think about in relation to the ocean. So recorded memory, anticipatory memory, that's the one I actually found harder about with humanities material. Collective memory and also traumatic memory. And so that's maybe a form that's in conversation with some of the materials Stefan brought up. So a couple thoughts here. One, what forms do we assume that memory takes? Written, inscribed, or other? How might the example of seaweed archives present an example where we see rehydration as a process of remembering? So not rewriting or even reperforming, but rehydration is a process of remembering. Second, if cyanotypes in dry kelp are photographic negatives in a way developed by seawater and climate, are they also historical witnesses to climate change? So future seaweeds may be responding to anthropogenic climate change in different ways that may or may not manifest in their morphological forms. So this might help us think about the shape of future seaweed archives that also reflect these changes. Next, perhaps thinking with seaweeds changes what we might call the media imaginary of the Anthropocene. Instead of defining it as a form of writing or geologic inscription in the stratigraphic record, perhaps the Anthropocene for seaweeds involves different kinds of saturations. So here, saturation is a material heuristic for conceptualizing the multiscalar changes that will come to characterize kelp forests around the world. But I think this is only part of the picture. And perhaps more hopefully from another point of view, we could also see that seaweeds are not always the passive victims of climate change, but actually long-standing architects of the atmosphere through the way that they produce oxygen. So it's no wonder that Sylvia Earle has called the ocean the blue lungs of the planet and urged us to take care of botanical ecologies if we want to continue to breathe. But as we breathe in the exhalations of seaweeds, we do this no matter where we live. And so as life processes transpire under the ocean, perhaps we archival observers looking at all of this, find that we have always already been saturated by kelp. All right, thank you.
I'll start off the comments just by saying I love the layered integration of your talks, of your talk, both of them together and separately. It was really just so effective. And so thank you. So I guess we can start actually, I have a question, if you don't mind. I'll start off the questions by saying, can you talk a little bit more about anticipatory memory?
Oh yeah, so there's people on this call who will also have thought about it, but uh, this had to do with conversations with the microbiologists in the Ocean Memory Working Group who wanted to, and so this includes Alison Santoro, who wanted to account for the way that microbes in the ocean might be said to remember given repeated exposures to something, to some kind of substance. So in the rare biosphere, she was thinking about, and I think this was also coming from Mandy Joy, was thinking about how microbes that partially degrade oil, if they're exposed once, they'll be more ready the next time the oil comes by to more quickly break down the oil. And that's a gross oversimplification. But it was an example of what she was thinking of as anticipatory memory. So how would the microbes retain a memory or be ready to partially break down an oil compound the next time it comes by? And I found that was really, I was struggling to think of similar examples in the humanities, and I don't think I came up with a good one. But the other categories like recorded memory, like, that's something I think we all have an intuitive sense of. Collective memory was fun, and I think that relates both to the microbes, but also to conversations in the humanities. And traumatic memory seems to also be a really common one, because you can
Right.
look at just so there's a lot there. So
Thank you.
Melody, I was just as a general question, I was curious about how this book came about, and maybe you could just talk a little bit more about the book, and then you bring Stefan in and who the other contributors are, just a little bit more information about it.
Oh yeah, sure. So I was trying to keep it short at the beginning, but let me go back. I can share screen and take you to the table of contents, because it's what we always turn to first. So actually, sorry, let me exit and okay, go back here. Yeah, so oh, I forgot to tell you the story about the day the conference happened, and unfortunately, we hadn't brought Stefan out at that stage in the process. But so Rafiko was going to be in Santa Barbara as a visiting scholar, and we wanted to hold this conference on saturation as something to do while he was in town. And then it morphed into a much broader project than we thought, but it started with this conference. And the conference happened to be held on a day that was in February, and Santa Barbara got 5 inches of rain that day, which is really a lot for us. Like it's flooding level. So I remember being at the 4th floor of this one building as we were all kind of packed in, and everyone's phones were going off, getting alerts about XYZ getting flooded, and we had to change the dinner location because there was like the waves were too high, and other parts were flooded. So it was I guess kind of I don't know, I guess an irony that the saturation conference itself got really saturated by water. So this collection was trying to think through, well, what's the use of saturation like with water, but also beyond water, because this could have been a set of essays that are about thinking with water, and there is a lot of work in the humanities about that. But we wanted to open it up to different kinds of saturation. So as you can see in the through the different titles of the contributions, many of these have to do with media. Some of them have to do with fossil fuels. So for example, Avery Slater's imagination of the aquifer, the Ogala aquifer, which is has been a site of contestation, and one of the reasons why people went to Standing Rock to defend this porous underground place. That was an interesting site of imagination. We have a couple essays on different kinds of sonic saturation too. So from John Shiga, and then wireless saturation or signals from Rahul Mukherjee. We also have a couple pieces thinking about what saturates through different kinds of liquids. So Vishnu Priya Ghosh has an essay on thinking about HIV saturation in the blood and what constitute undetectable levels of saturation. So there's a specific quantity at which you're presumed to not, I guess, be undetectable. So being undetectable is a good thing in this case because it means it's low enough and hasn't hit a kind of threshold. So those are some pieces that think through different kinds of materials. I have to say that the precipitate section of the collection also was surprisingly interesting in part because it departs from water sometimes more than the previous chapters. But it's also looking at what falls out of saturation. So in one interesting sort of metaphoric sense, Lisa Hahn's essay looked at seismic testing in the ocean and the way that it affects whales. And so she came up with the precipitate as a way of talking, as a way of seeing the whales literally coming out of the ocean from the necropolitics or the violence of being affected by these high decibel seismic surveys. So her chapter did something different there. Bhaskar Sarkar's essay on media saturation in Southern agencies was also, I think, a good cultural way that took saturation away from water, but to think about economic saturation and also what are stereotypical depictions of the global South. And so he asked this question in a way to consider how the space of this one space of a marketplace, he saw pirated DVDs at the same time as these deep fried snacks, and it gave him kind of a starting place to consider, like Stefan did so well, multiple forms of saturation in the same case study. So he was seeing saturated fats next to this sort of this wealth of pirated media, and then use that as a place to think about how the South has been considered as a sort of super saturated, always too much, always in excess site. So I'll maybe not summarize everything, but leave it a bit there, and just say also that the saturation, began as a conference, but then ended up morphing into this this larger project after we asked the initial contributors to see if they wanted to develop their talks into longer pieces, and then we invited Stefan as well as a couple others, Avery Slater and Joanna Zelinska, also to contribute pieces. And just a quick backstory for Stefan. I realized after we figured out an organization for this that the contributors who came after the conference all ended up being in the water section, and I'm not sure why, but that's how it worked out.
And it's interesting because it's like thinking about media saturation, definitely seems really sort of topical for right now, and just sort of in the pandemic kind of world that we've been living in, this landscape. But I imagine that this book predated the pandemic, correct? Like this idea.
2017.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
it's interesting. And then just thinking about the sonic saturation and all of this, the sound stuff that, we've been doing here with Ocean Memory, it seems really, I'm excited to read it. So
Yeah, actually those two connect really, really well. I think the one thing we're missing is we lost an essay on cognitive saturation, and that would be like very, very good for the pandemic.
I think Jody has a question.
Well, actually, I have a set of comments. First, thanking the speakers for stimulating me, saturating my brain cells right now with some interesting new thoughts. I'll just make a quick comment about purple. There's an image that I use in almost every lecture I give on the polar environment that is an entirely purple hued image of frost flowers over new sea ice in the Arctic. It's totally purple. Everybody loves it and I love it, but I have to go rethink what it means to depict something as the color purple. And I also was reflecting on how when I was a young scientist, we didn't publish in color. We had to create our graphics and our images all in black and white. And so we didn't have that sense to build upon or abuse. And now I can see that there's so much psychology into the color graphics that we're using. So thank you for highlighting that. And then if I could say one more thing, in Stefan's list of definitions of saturation, I didn't quite see the one that's closest to my heart, which concerns the microbial world in the ocean and enzyme kinetics. So enzymes get saturated, and the rate at which they can work comes to a halt if they're saturated. If they're not saturated, they can keep working and they can work faster. And so I'm sitting here wondering if that is a form of encoding memory, that the way an organism, especially microbes, which are fondly called bags of enzymes, the way microbes have recorded different responses to different things they sense in the environment by when their individual enzymes saturate or don't saturate. And I'm going to sleep on this, but thank you for that.
Anya?
Thank you both. Yeah, that was really interesting. I have a really small question that during Stefan's talk, I just found my mind wandering off. Skin of the sea. Where did that come from? What is that? when you said that, I was like, wait, what? What is skin of the sea? And yeah, I don't know. I can just I guess in like embodied literature, there's so much conversation about skin, but then in that case, it's an organ that is distinct from, fascia and bones and muscles and whatnot. And then my mind was wandering off as like, okay, well, beneath the surface of the sea, you have water columns that do have different compositions. And, but then in the way that you were using it in reference to color, like the skin's color is actually kind of a combination of the entire water column, right? Anyway, so I would just love to know more about that concept. And yeah.
Thank you, Anya. I think really thinking about the metaphorics of it, right? And not so much about whether skin operates as, a fully digested scientific term of art for people who also talk in terms of water columns and so on, right? But I think that sort of symbolic difference between the surface and the depth is kind of what kind of captured me, right? Like how is the surface understood either to obscure or to disclose what is within? And I'm really building on the work that I'm doing with Ava Hayward, which is for another book that Melody is editing, in which she assigned Ava and me to think about relations between surface and depth and the symbolics of those with respect to the ocean. I wanted to go back though to something that Jody mentioned, which was just, and thinking with Melody's talk too, just thinking about this other term that maybe subtends some of what we're thinking about here, and that's the term storage, the concept of storage, and that saturation is part of, it seems like maybe saturation is part of what happens when there's kind of an excess of things that can no longer be stored and that become kind of released. And the kind of way that the excess operates in Melody's talk and in mine, the materials we use, has this really interesting difference, because the seaweed and the rehydration of media that the seaweed helps us think about, operates in this very densely material metabolic world. And when the saturation doesn't quite work in the digital world that I'm writing about, we get into something else, which is the glitch. And I wonder if there's an interesting difference between, the excess of storage when we think about storage in a digital medium versus storage in an analog medium. That doesn't actually connect back to what you were asking, Anya, but it could.
Can I speak just quickly to the skin issue? Because there is a scientific definition. The skin of the ocean is called the sea surface microlayer. So it's like 50 micrometers. It's very thin, but it represents the interface between water and air. And at that interface, at that skin, accumulates all sorts of organic matter and tiny microbes and things. It's a very rich environment, actually. There's a whole microbiome of the skin of the ocean. And if you introduce wave action, you completely disrupt that until it settles back down. So there's a whole body of work on that very issue. So it has a scientific context.
Daniel, I think I saw your hand up next. Did you have a, oh, you're muted.
So the question of skin for me is kind of interesting because I think it actually has to do with the human, I don't know if bias is the right word, but a human perception element that we're light sensing individuals. And so that's our primary way of thinking. And we see surfaces that reflect light as primary things. And so the surface of the ocean is one of these boundaries, and that's what we look at. And I was very kind of struck when I started working with oceanographers at the focus on the surface and the bottom, and that there are not that many tools to think about the water column, whereas the water column is actually what the sea is. So it was kind of interesting. I think there's something about what we bring to the act of looking and thinking, that we see this surface. So I'm just curious about that. And then I was really struck in both your talks, and this is something about maybe transdisciplinarity that you both bring to our larger conversation that I'm curious about, is that you reach for sometimes very surprising connections between things that seem, as a layperson, completely from different realms. I'm like, wait a minute, how did they go from, this to that? And I'm just curious, like, if you have a sense of, because I'm, as a painter, I feel like I'm bringing things that are totally foreign matter to other disciplines. And I'm just curious, are you aware at how alien that set of associations is for, maybe, I mean, I imagine for scientists and for visual artists, for example, like, can you say something about that willingness to just go for these metaphorical connections that on the surface may or may not, like, I mean, I was just like, wait, oh my God. So now I have to think of these totally vastly separate elements in the same, thought bubble. So I'm just curious whether you can speak to that, like, as a way of, because I feel like it's part of what we've tried to do over the past few years is share these things that we can do in different disciplines that we can't do in others. And I feel like what you did tonight is like something I don't know how to do at all. I mean, I can kind of dream it, but I can't do it. So that's.
Does the author of Alien Ocean want to take a first leap?
I'll just plead James Cameron, right? Just those examples of Titanic and Avatar, like, what is he doing, right? And why does it work for particular audiences in those ways, right? So, I mean, I think in some ways, those metaphorical implosions, those connections of different kinds of things you might think of as different kinds of domains, is actually right at the center of what a lot of people like James Cameron do. Like, what is it with all those white people in Titanic? Is there something, what is going on in that movie? There's a lot of layers, and James Cameron knows it, right? I mean, he may not articulate it in quite the same way that, those of us thinking about critical film theory or critical race theory may, but it's kind of there to be teased out in a lot of ways. Like, why are the Na'vi blue? And there's so much of the imaginary of kind of race as a question of color in the United States that tries to pretend to this kind of fantasy of color blindness by picking this kind of non-occurring color for human skin of like bioluminescent purple blue and saying, look, there it is. You know, I'm playing with race, but I'm not playing with race, right? Like James Cameron is trying to do both things at the same time. And so I feel like in some sense, the analysis is just sort of like, okay, let's just ask a really basic question about what's going on there. You know, why is this effective for particular audiences and not others, right? And then of course, yeah, I mean, over to you, Melody.
I'm not sure I have a good example, but I'll just respond with something I was thinking about from Stefan's talk as well, which is the cases where some of the artwork you look at actively engages with surfaces. So the surface of the wall, the surface of the film still, or other flat media. Whereas I think, something I was thinking with Anya's comment was about the production of a color in the ocean as one looks through the water in a three-dimensional sense as well, which is not exactly the same activity as looking at the cultural production of these of films or other flat media that draws on a kind of color archive. So I'm still kind of sitting with that question, but I guess maybe to Daniel's earlier one, there's almost a kind of going with your gut with associations happening, and then sometimes they're bad ones, and sometimes they're ones that lead you in an interesting way to something else. So I feel like I rely on that a lot, and an instinct for puns is also not unrelated. And you could see from Stefan's really useful mapping from the Oxford English Dictionary of all these uses of saturation, sort of where you can go with those linkages. But something I also like to tell my students is that that's only in English. And so if they're working in a second or third language, then you can draw a whole other set of puns or etymologies from a different tree. So if one was studying something like saturation, I don't know, working from Mandarin Chinese, it'd probably be a different kind of tree of associations, and that could lead you to some interesting other questions. So I also try to be language specific about that particular, tactic of analysis.
It makes me think of associative memory. A lot of memory is actually recalled by other memories that are not necessarily connected to them, or by contextual cues. And so, for example, in genetic evolution, there are coevolutionary traits that happen when something is evolutionarily advantageous, but there are associated processes that create other traits that are not evolutionary advantageous, but that might become so. I feel like there's something there that kind of intersects between why we might want to bring together different disciplines and how memory works. I don't know. I'm just curious as a thread to tease out.
It's an interesting scale-specific question too. So when do lessons from biology at a particular scale work or not work as well for describing other elements in culture that maybe deal with something like association? But another question I had, pivoting a little bit here, coming from Jody's comment about enzyme kinetics. I'm not sure if I recall as a group that we've thought about when does memory stop, or is it interrupted? And the example you gave of saturation in enzyme kinetics, like that's when something stops. Like that's kind of interesting to think with too. Not what triggers a memory or a process, but how does something know when to stop, or is physically encouraged to stop somehow? And I'm not sure where else to take that question, but it's a little different, I think, than the way we'd been exploring memory versus forgetting in the ocean. So also, like, how does something know when to turn off or stop or cease its labor?
I just wanted to jump in with a really quick comment when both of you were giving your presentations, but particularly when Stefan was talking about color saturation, I kept thinking about color saturation as being related to the way humans experience memory. Like literally our memories are color saturated, and we tend to, in our media presentations, like on film, we tend to kind of present memory as a color saturated phenomenon sometimes.
Oh, or black and white sometimes, right?
Yeah. And my other quick comment was just in terms of James Cameron. I remember when I saw Avatar, I didn't wonder why the people were blue, but I did wonder why they were rhythmic. Because so, but that's another conversation. But
Good.
anyway, I think we are coming up on, let's see, my clock says 5:43, which is 8:43. So we may have to wrap up because I think we may have run overtime because we usually wrap up around 8:30. Anybody else want to jump in with a quick comment before we wrap things up or question? Okay, well, I want to thank both Stefan and Melody for a really amazing, layered and fascinating presentation. And thanks as well to my co-organizers. And we'll post this as soon as it's edited. And we look forward to seeing you at our next Ocean Memory seminar.